The scanner returned a null result. Not a low reading, not a partial signal degraded by atmospheric interference. A null, the complete absence of data where data should have been, and senior analyst Veth Karas had never seen that before. Not in 11 years of planetary survey work. Not on gas giants with electromagnetic storms that could strip the paint from a hull. Not on neutron-adjacent bodies where the laws of physics behaved like suggestions. She stared at the readout for a long moment, then looked at her secondary display, then at the tertiary backup that the conclave required all survey vessels to maintain precisely, because primary and secondary systems sometimes failed. All three screens showed the same thing. Nothing. The planet below her was the third in a yellow dwarf system, roughly 1.2 times the mass of the conclave's standard comparative baseline, with a nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere, liquid water oceans, and electromagnetic signatures consistent with a mid-tier technological civilization. It had cities. It had satellites. It had radio transmissions they'd been passively collecting for 47 of this world's years without making contact. The planet clearly existed. Her weapons scanner said it did not. The conclave's survey mandate was, by design, not subtle. Veth Karas understood this. She had understood it from her first day of training, when her instructor, a blunt, six-limbed Drethani named Osivek who had personally surveyed over 200 worlds, told her cohort exactly what they were and exactly what they were not. "We are not diplomats," Osivek had said, packing the length of the training bay with the particular rolling gait of someone who had spent more years on ships than on planetary surfaces. "We are not scientists, though we use scientific instruments. We are not soldiers, though we carry weapons of our own. We are accountants. We go to worlds. We count what they have. We report what they could do with it. And then the conclave decides whether to say hello." Veth Karas had found this framing uncomfortable at the time. She found it more uncomfortable now, 11 years later, because she had come to understand that Osivek was being precise rather than cynical. The conclave's first question about any civilization was never who are they or what do they want, or can we learn from each other asterisk. The first question was always the same. What can they do to us? The weapons scan was designed to answer that question. It was the most sophisticated instrument in the survey fleet's arsenal, capable of detecting refined metallurgical signatures, concentrated energy sources, fissionable material densities, directed energy weapon emitters, and the unique chemical fingerprints of biological and chemical armaments, all from high orbit without the target civilization ever knowing a scan had occurred. It had been tested on 43 civilizations during Veth Karas' service. On 43 civilizations, it had returned detailed, sortable, analyzable data. On this one, it returned silence. She ran a diagnostic. The instrument was functioning perfectly. She ran the scan again. "No." "Technician Priel," she said without looking up from her console, "come look at this." Priel was young, barely past his second adult molt, and had the particular nervous energy of someone who still believed that unusual results were exciting rather than dangerous. He crossed the bridge quickly, looked at her screen, and made a sound that, translated loosely from Veth Karas' native Hethali into a human analog, would have been something like asterisk ha asterisk. "That's not a malfunction reading," he said. "No. The instrument is working." "Yes. So the planet has no weapons," Veth Karas said. "According to our scanner, a civilization with radio telescopes, orbital satellites, nuclear energy signatures, and what appears to be a global network of some kind of information-sharing technology." She paused. "No weapons." Priel was quiet for a moment. "That's impossible," he said. "That was my interpretation also. Every civilization with that level of technology has weapons. That's not ideology, that's mathematics. Resource competition, territorial defense. The scanner should be detecting at least." "Priel," Yes, I know, she looked at him steadily. That's the problem. She filed her report to the conclave that same rotation, flagging the anomaly with a priority 2 notation, significant irregularity, potential instrument issue, requesting secondary survey vessel for confirmation. She expected a response within a standard week. She received one in 14 hours, which told her something she filed away carefully. Someone at the conclave level had been waiting for news about this planet. The response was not what she'd expected. It did not assign a secondary vessel. It did not ask her to rescan. It asked her to hold position, maintain passive observation only, and wait for the arrival of an assessment team that would join her within 30 cycles. 30 cycles. An assessment team, which meant conclave intelligence, which meant this planet had a file that predated her survey mission, which meant the null reading was not a surprise to everyone. The universe, Vethkara's thought, was very large and she had been told very little of it. She held position. She maintained passive observation. She did not touch the weapons scanner again, partly because she'd been told not to run active scans that might be detected, and partly because she was no longer sure she wanted to know what a third reading would say, or wouldn't say. The distinction had started to feel important. She spent the 30 cycles reviewing the passive data that accumulated over 47 years of listening. Radio transmissions, mostly, electromagnetic noise that told a detailed story about a civilization if you knew how to read it. The survey fleet had translation teams for this, and the conclave's archives held 47 years of processed data on these creatures. The creatures called themselves humans. Their world was called Earth, which meant, in their primary languages, something approximately equivalent to soil or asterisk ground asterisk. They had named their planet after the material beneath their feet. Vethkara's found this detail strange in a way she couldn't immediately articulate, and she let it sit in the back of her mind like a splinter. They were bipedal, soft-skinned, remarkably fragile by most biological metrics, no natural armor, limited environmental tolerance, a lifespan so short that it bordered on tragic. They had no venom. Their young were born in a state of helplessness so complete that they required years of intensive parental support simply to survive, let alone function. And they had been broadcasting electromagnetic signals for approximately 120 years now, which meant, in terms of galactic timekeeping, they had only just discovered they could shout into the void. They didn't know anyone was listening. They were, by every conclave metric, a primitive and vulnerable species. And yet, the null reading. She pulled up a transmission dataset from 30 years prior, before her survey mission had formally begun, before anyone in the fleet had focused specifically on this system, and she started reading. The assessment team arrived in a vessel Vethkara's didn't recognize, which was itself unsettling. She knew the conclave's fleet classes well. This ship had no class designation in any registry she could access, which meant it existed in a registry she couldn't access, which meant she was about to be outranked in her own survey zone. The team leader came aboard first, and Vethkara's had the immediate, visceral sense of being evaluated by someone who had already formed a conclusion about her. His name was Assessor Dreval. He was Hethali like her, which offered precisely zero comfort. He was older than anyone she'd seen in active field service, old enough that his secondary nerve sheaths had begun to show through the skin along his jaw in the distinctive gray-silver pattern that meant he'd lived past the third life phase. He moved through her ship as if he owned it, which was, she supposed, accurate in the ways that mattered. He didn't review her scans. He already had them. "Tell me what you thought," he said, settling into her own chair with an ease that made it clear the invitation was not optional. "When you saw the null result." "I thought the instrument was malfunctioning." "And when you confirmed it wasn't?" She hesitated. "I thought the result meant either that the species had no weapons, which I dismissed as statistically impossible, or that they had weapons our scanner cannot detect. Which did you settle on? Neither, Vethkara said. I don't think those are the only options. Dreval looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression that she couldn't read. Why not? Because the scanner doesn't return null when it can't detect something. It returns a low or absent reading with an estimated margin of error. Null is different. Null means the scanner actively found nothing, no metallic signatures, no fission products, no energy weapon emitters, no chemical or biological agents. That's not the same as I can't see what's there asterisk. That's the instrument saying there is nothing here that matches any weapon's signature in my database. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Technician Priel, standing near the rear wall, shifted his weight uncomfortably. Good, Dreval said finally. That's the correct interpretation, and it's the one that's been keeping the Conclave's analysts occupied for the past 19 years. Vethkara's went still. 19 years. We've been running passive observation since well before your survey mission was assigned. Your mission was intended to confirm what our analysts had already concluded. He looked at the planet on her main display, blue-green and unhurried, rolling through its orbit with complete indifference to the ships above it. The humans don't appear in our weapons database because the Conclave has never seen anything like what they have. Our scanner isn't malfunctioning. It's telling the truth. Then what, she said carefully, do they have? Dreval pulled up a file on her console, a file she'd never have been able to access on her own clearance level. And the first thing she saw was not a weapons catalog or a threat assessment or a military capability index. It was a list of wars. The list was long. That wasn't the disturbing part. Vethkara's had studied enough civilizations to know that warfare was a near-universal feature of species that developed technology, at least in their early periods. Resource competition, territorial instinct, the psychological tendency to categorize others as threats. War was practically predictable. What was disturbing was the column beside each entry. Not casualties, not duration, not geographic scope, though all of those were there. The disturbing column was the one labeled asterisk reason for cessation. She read through the first dozen entries. Then she went back and read them again. They kept stopping, she said. Yes. Not because one side was destroyed, not because resources were exhausted. They stopped because, she scanned the column, treaty, negotiation, armistice, economic collapse, leadership death, popular uprising against the war itself. They stopped because they decided to. Repeatedly, Dreval confirmed. And then they started again. Also repeatedly. She scrolled further down the list, and the list kept going, and at the bottom was a notation from a Conclave analyst 19 years ago that said simply, pattern unclear, behavior inconsistent with all modeled civilizational development curves. Recommend ongoing monitoring. What does our scanner categorize as a weapon? She asked. Anything designed with the primary function of causing harm to a biological organism or destroying constructed infrastructure, Dreval said. Refined metallurgical alloys with ballistic applications, energy generation systems with directed lethality potential, chemical and biological agents with harmful biological interactions. He paused. The humans have all of these things, significant quantities of all of these things. Then why? Because, Dreval said, and he leaned forward slightly, and the gray-silver patterns along his jaw caught the light. The humans have done something our scanner has no category for. They have built weapon systems so enormous, so thoroughly saturating their entire civilization, so deeply embedded into their economic and political infrastructure, that the scanner cannot separate the weapon's signature from the civilization's signature. They are indistinguishable. He let that sit for a moment. The null reading isn't the absence of weapons. It's the absence of a distinction between weapons and everything else. The bridge was very quiet. That's Priel started. Unprecedented, Dreval said flatly. Yes. Vethkaras looked at the planet. The unhurried blue-green planet, rolling through its orbit, broadcasting signals into the dark about music and mathematics, and the eating habits of small domesticated animals, and the outcomes of athletic competitions, and the deaths of their leaders and 10,000 other things, having no idea any of them were listening. "What does the Conclave want to do?" she asked. "The Conclave," Dreval said, "wants to understand them before deciding anything, which is why you are going to help me review 47 years of passive data with a specific question in mind." He pulled up a new screen. "The weapons are embedded in the civilization. That tells us what they have. What we don't know, what the Conclave's analysts have not been able to determine after 19 years of observation, is why. Why build to that level? What are they afraid of?" He looked at her, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes that she recognized from 11 years of survey work. The particular expression of someone who had already looked at the answer and found it more disturbing than the question. "Or," he said quietly, "who?" They started with the transmissions from 40 years back. Vethkaras had expected to work through them methodically, cataloging patterns, flagging anomalies, the same painstaking analytical process she used for any civilization study. What she had not expected was to find herself unable to stop. The humans talked constantly, incessantly, to each other, about each other, past each other, over each other, a species in permanent, overlapping, contradictory conversation with itself. Their transmissions contained art and propaganda, and journalism and entertainment and political argument and scientific discourse, all tangled together, in a way that no conclave civilization had ever quite managed, because conclave civilizations developed these categories separately and kept them organized. The humans seemed to have decided, at some point that Vethkaras couldn't pinpoint, to simply broadcast everything simultaneously and let the receiver sort it out. "Look at this," Priel said on the second cycle of their review, pulling up a transmission set from 32 years prior. "This is he checked the translation notation, a news program, a broadcast of current events, and they are reporting at the same time in the same broadcast on a military operation their government is conducting, a protest against that military operation happening in their own cities, a scientific discovery unrelated to either, and an animal." He paused. "A single animal that was rescued from a drainage canal." "Which story received the most transmission attention?" Dreval asked, not looking up from his own screen. Priel checked. He made the sound that meant *H again. "The animal." Dreval nodded, as if this confirmed something. "What does that tell you?" Vethkaras asked him. "That the humans have a cognitive architecture we don't fully model yet." He set down his work and looked at both of them. Every civilization the Conclave has encountered organizes collective attention in ways that map onto their threat-response hierarchy. Civilizations that developed under apex predator pressure focus collective attention on large-scale threats. Civilizations that developed under resource scarcity focus on distribution and storage. Civilizations that developed through social competition focus on political hierarchy. He gestured at Priel's screen. The humans are paying more attention to one rescued animal than to their own military operations. That's not irrational. It tells us something about what they value at a biological level. But it also means their attention allocation doesn't follow threat logic. "Or," Vethkaras said slowly, "their threat response doesn't require their full attention, because the threat response is already built into the infrastructure." Both Dreval and Priel looked at her. "The weapons are embedded," she said. "They don't have to think about defense because defense is automatic. It's already everywhere. So their cognitive attention is freed for other things, for the animal in the drainage canal." She turned back to her screen. "What kind of civilization," she said, more to herself than to them, "builds a defense system so total that it becomes invisible to the defenders themselves?" No one answered, because the answer was somewhere in 47 years of transmissions, and they hadn't found it yet. They found it on the 6th cycle of the review, and it was Veth Kara's who found it, and she wished afterward that it had been someone else. She'd been tracking a specific thread through the transmission data military communications, which the humans encrypted, but whose metadata was still visible, and metadata told a story even without content. She was looking at escalation patterns, moments when military activity spiked, trying to understand the threat response cycle. And she found the spikes. They were there, regular, predictable. But they weren't pointed outward. The military activity spikes did not correlate with external threats, asteroid approaches, environmental disasters, anything that would represent a threat from outside the civilization. They correlated with each other, with other human military activities, on the other side of the planet. The human's threat model, she realized, sitting very still at her console, was not directed at any external force. The weapons, all of the weapons, the civilization-saturating defense infrastructure that had blinded her scanner, was directed at themselves. They had built the largest weapons system the Conclave's instruments had ever encountered, and they had built it to point at each other. "Dreval," she said, and her voice came out level, which surprised her. "I need you to look at something." He crossed to her station. He looked at the correlation matrix she'd built. He stood there for longer than she expected, long enough that she began to wonder if she'd made an error, if her analysis was wrong, if the data didn't mean what she thought it meant. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Suspected," he corrected. "Since the first passive survey data came in. Known since I saw the null reading from your scan," he straightened. "Yes. The human's weapons architecture is internally directed. They are not preparing for an external threat. They never were." "Then what are they afraid of?" "Each other," Dreval said. "They have always been afraid of each other. The weapons exist because the humans cannot agree on who among themselves should have the weapons, so they have ensured that everyone has them, as a way of ensuring that no single group can use them." He moved back to his own station. "It's called deterrence. Our analysts identified the concept early in the observation period. It requires, as a foundational assumption, that every party in the system is willing to use the weapons if threatened." "Are they?" Priel asked. "They have been," Dreval said, and he pulled up a different file, and the list it contained was shorter than the war list but heavier somehow, a different kind of weight. And at the top of it was a date from 80 years ago and 2 city names that Veth Kara's had to look up in the translation database. She looked them up. She put the translation down. "They used them," she said, "on themselves." "On each other," Dreval said. "Yes, once, 80 years ago, and then they stopped, and then they built more." The room held that for a moment. "They built more," Priel repeated, as if saying it again would make it parse differently. "After they saw what the weapons did, they built more." "They built enough," Dreval said, "that the next use would end the civilization, and then they used that fact, the guaranteed end of their own civilization, as the mechanism of deterrence. The threat is not we will hurt you. The threat is we will end everything, including ourselves, if you make us." He looked at them both. They have structured the survival of their species around the credible promise of mutual annihilation, and it has so far worked. Veth Kara's thought of the transmission, the news broadcast, the animal in the drainage canal, a species that had pointed enough firepower at itself to end its own existence, and then gone back to watching animals being rescued from drainage canals, because the deterrence system was already built, it was already running. It didn't need their attention. It just needed them to be willing. "The Conclave asked what they're afraid of," she said. "That's the wrong question." She turned to look at the planet, still rolling, still blue-green, still indifferent. "The question is what they're willing to do." Dreval filed a Priority 1 report to the Conclave that cycle. Veth Kara's was present when he sent it. She was not permitted to read the full text. Her clearance still had limits, even now, but she saw the summary classification at the top of the document, and the classification was a category designation. she had never encountered in 11 years of survey work. Non-standard civilization, threat profile undetermined, recommended action, active assessment immediate. Active assessment meant contact. Preliminary contact, carefully controlled under the Conclave's first approach protocols, which were designed for civilizations that didn't know they were being observed. The protocols assumed the observed civilization would be startled, would be curious, would ask questions the Conclave knew how to answer. The protocols did not have a section for civilizations that had spent 80 years living next to their own extinction. The response from the Conclave came in 8 hours this time, which was not a good sign. 8 hours meant the upper levels of the Conclave had been assembled for an emergency session. Emergency sessions of the upper Conclave were, in Veth Karas's experience, things that happened in stories told by analysts who'd been in the field too long, not things that happened in active survey operations. The response authorized contact. It also contained a secondary authorization that Dreval read twice before he said anything, which made Veth Karas's secondary hearts clench in a way she didn't like. "They want a capability test," he said finally. She waited. Before formal contact, before the humans know we're here, he set the authorization down. The Conclave wants to know if the deterrence system is real, if the willingness is real, not from the data, from a test. "What kind of test?" Veth Karas said, and she was surprised by how flat her own voice sounded, how emptied of the question's weight. "A simulated threat, limited, controlled, a signal that could be interpreted as an external approach, something their detection systems would pick up, something that would trigger whatever response they have for an unidentified contact from outside their world." He looked at her steadily. "We want to see what they do. We want to see if the willingness is real." "And if it is?" Priel asked. Dreval didn't answer immediately. "We recommend the Conclave classify them as isolated contact, no first approach. We mark the system as observed, monitored, and avoided. We tell no one where they are. We let them continue building their deterrence system in peace, and we hope, with significant sincerity, that they never develop the propulsion to leave their own solar system before the system stabilizes." "And if the willingness is not real?" Veth Karas asked. "If it's a bluff, if the deterrence only works because no one has called it?" "Then they're a civilization with significant weapons infrastructure and no actual willingness to use it," Dreval said, "which makes them manageable, which means the Conclave has more options." He said asterisk options, the way Osivek had once said asterisk accountants. Not cynically, just precisely, in a way that made the word do more weight-bearing than it was designed for. "I want to run the test," Veth Karas said. Dreval looked at her. "I'm the senior analyst on this mission," she said. "I found the correlation. I should be the one." She stopped, reorganized. "I want to see what they do." "I know," Dreval said. "That's not why I'm hesitating." He looked at the planet for a long moment. "I'm hesitating because I've read the full file. 19 years of observation, 47 years of transmissions. The Conclave's analysts have been studying these creatures for nearly 2 decades, and the thing they cannot model, the thing that keeps generating the recommendation to wait, to observe more, to not act yet, is not the weapons. It's not the deterrence architecture. It's not the willingness to accept mutual destruction." He turned back to her. "It's what they do in the time between the crises, the animal in the drainage canal, the music, the mathematical proofs transmitted into empty space as gifts to no one, the stories they tell each other about imaginary people for the apparent purpose of making themselves feel emotions they could have had in their actual lives." He shook his head slightly, not a Hethali gesture, she realized, but something he'd picked up from watching 47 years of human footage, a thing humans did when they were confronting something they couldn't categorize. "They are simultaneously the most dangerous and the most baffling civilization we have ever observed," he said. "And I have been in this field for 60 years. Whatever we see when we run the test, Whatever they do, I am not certain we will understand it. Not really. Not yet. Run it anyway, she said. The test was simple by the conclave's technical standards. A survey probe, unpowered, non-responsive, shaped in no way that suggested intelligence, dropped from their position toward the outer edge of the planet's orbital zone, broadcasting a tight beam signal in a frequency the humans used for deep space observation. Not a message, just a signal, just enough to register on their instruments as asterisk something is out here that wasn't out here before. They ran it at the start of a human night cycle. Veth Karas sat at her console and watched the planet's electromagnetic output for any change. She waited 30 minutes, an hour. She was beginning to think the probe had missed, or the humans hadn't detected it, or their deep space observation systems weren't active, when Priel said quietly, "Look at this." The electromagnetic activity from 3 sites on the planet's surface changed simultaneously. Not spiked, changed. Shifted frequency. Focused. The humans' deep space observation arrays, she'd identified them in the passive data months ago, massive structures in high-altitude locations across multiple continents, had noticed the probe and were now doing something. She watched the signal analysis feed. The arrays were broadcasting toward the probe. They were trying to communicate with it. "They think it's a visitor," Priel said, and there was something odd in his voice. "Wait," Dreval said. The military electromagnetic signatures, the encrypted channels, the traffic patterns she'd learned to read without reading their content, those were changing too. Not with the frantic escalation of a threat response, with something more deliberate, more organized. "They're not panicking," she said. "No. They detected an unknown signal from outside their solar system, and they are." She worked through the pattern. "They're coordinating, across multiple continents, across what the transmission data suggests are political entities that historically don't coordinate easily." "How long did the coordination take?" Dreval asked. Priel checked. 11 minutes from first detection to synchronized response. 11 minutes. To achieve cross-civilizational coordination in response to an unknown external signal, across political entities that spent 80 years pointing weapons at each other. The military signatures organized, settled, became very precise, and the deep space arrays kept broadcasting their attempt at communication, hopeful, patient, aimed at a probe that couldn't answer them. Then one of the military signatures changed in a way Veth Karas didn't recognize, and Dreval made a very small sound, and she looked at him. "They've activated something," he said, "something I don't have in the passive observation catalog." He was working quickly, pulling frequency signatures, cross-referencing. "This isn't from their standard defense architecture. This is new. This came online in the last," he checked, 3 years. Veth Karas pulled up her own analysis. The new signal was coming from multiple orbital positions. The humans had objects in orbit, she'd cataloged their satellites extensively. But these positions were different. These were things she'd marked as inert, non-functional debris. They weren't debris. They had been waiting. "They put weapons in orbit," she said, "without broadcasting that they had weapons in orbit. They've been broadcasting their surface systems, making those visible, and hiding an entirely separate orbital layer in debris fields." "How many?" Priel asked very quietly. She counted the active signatures. She counted them again. She looked at Dreval. "The surface weapons system," she said, "the one our scanner found and couldn't separate from the civilization, that's not the deterrence architecture. That's the visible layer. The thing they show each other, the thing that's supposed to make the deterrence credible." She felt the shape of it settling into place with the particular cold clarity of a conclusion that had been true for a while before she'd seen it. The orbital layer is something else, something they haven't shown each other, something they built. "In case the deterrence failed," Dreval said. "In case mutual annihilation wasn't enough. In case the promise of ending everything didn't hold. In case someone, somewhere, decided to call the bluff. They had a backup. They had built a backup to the system, designed to end their civilization. Priel made a sound that Veth Karas had never heard from him, not the asterisk of curiosity, not the breath catch of surprise, something lower, something that didn't have a name in their language, because it described an emotion the Hethali didn't commonly experience. The feeling of looking at something reasonable, logical, and utterly alien, and understanding it completely and not understanding it at all. "The test," Dreval said softly. "We wanted to know if the willingness was real." He gestured at the screens, at the coordinated response, at the 11-minute synchronization, at the satellites that had been playing dead for years. "I believe," he said, "we have our answer." The Conclave's response to Dreval's second report was not 8 hours this time. It was 4 days. Veth Karas spent those 4 days reading. She read everything in the passive observation archive that she hadn't had clearance for before, which was substantial, and she read it with the orbital weapons layer in mind, which changed the texture of everything. The human stories, their entertainment, their art, their fiction, contained something she kept tripping over. A recurring figure. Not a hero exactly, not a champion in the way civilizational mythology usually enshrined champions. A figure who won not by being stronger, not by being better armed, not by being chosen or exceptional, but by being the last one standing. By outlasting. By absorbing costs that would stop anyone rational and continuing anyway. They had a word for it in their primary language. Stubbornness. They used it as an insult and a compliment simultaneously, which told her something about how deeply it ran. Their stories were full of characters who did irrational things for emotional reasons, and succeeded because the universe didn't have a prepared response for irrationality, executed with total commitment. Their stories were, she realized, not fantasies. They were instruction manuals. "They know what they are," she said aloud to no one, alone in the archive room on the 3rd day. The Conclave's response came on the 4th day. Dreval called her and Priel to the bridge to hear it. It was long. It contained a full analysis from the Conclave's strategic division, which was a division Veth Karas had known existed but never interacted with, and the analysis was detailed and thorough, and it reached, after thousands of words of careful diplomatic prose, a conclusion that the Conclave's strategic division had apparently not reached about any other civilization in the Conclave's 400-year recorded history. Leave them alone. Not initiate contact. Not open diplomatic channels. Not offer Conclave membership protocols. Not neutralize the threat, which was the option that existed in the authorization framework but which no one had written aloud. Leave them alone. Let them develop. Let the deterrent system stabilize or collapse on its own terms. Monitor from distance. Do not make contact. Do not let them know they'd been observed. Do not give them a reason to unify the visible and the hidden systems around an external target. They're afraid of us, Priel said, reading the conclusion of the report, not disbelief recognition. The Conclave is afraid of us, of humans. Not of what they have, Dreval said, of what they do with a reason. He looked at the planet. The deterrent system works because the humans can't agree with each other, because they are, in the language of their own transmissions, fractious and argumentative and historically incapable of sustained coordination. He paused. "We ran a test," he said, "an unknown signal from outside their solar system, 11 minutes to synchronize. The hidden weapons platform came online in 6. He turned away from the planet. If the Conclave makes first contact, if the humans understand that there are other civilizations out here, that the universe is populated, that there are species with capabilities they don't yet have, the fractiousness that makes their deterrent system work becomes the thing that ends." He picked up the Conclave's report, looked at it for a moment and set it down. "They stop pointing at each other," he said. "They point outward." The bridge was quiet. Outside the viewport, The planet rolled through its orbit, broadcasting music and sports results, and the outcomes of political arguments and footage of animals being helped by soft-handed creatures who named their world after the ground beneath their feet, who built weapons capable of ending their civilization, and then went back to watching the animals, who hid half their strength in debris fields and left it sleeping, patient, ready, waiting for a reason that hadn't arrived yet. Vethkara's thought of Osivek, 11 years ago, the training bay. We are accountants, we go to worlds, we count what they have, we report what they could do with it. She had counted, she had reported, and what the humans could do with it was a question the Conclave's strategic division had apparently decided it was better not to answer in practice. We're leaving, Dreval said. We'll hand the monitoring file to the Long-Range Observation Division. Passive only, no active scans, no contact protocols. We mark the system and we go. And if they develop propulsion, Vethkaras asked, if they leave the system on their own, if they come to us. Dreval was quiet for a long moment. Then, he said, we will have the conversation we didn't have today. And we will have it with a species that figured out how to cross interstellar space on its own, which will tell us something important about what they are by then. He didn't say what that something was. He didn't have to. She'd read 47 years of transmissions. She'd seen the war list and the cessation column and the orbital debris that wasn't debris. She'd watched 11 minutes of coordination that should have taken months. She knew what they'd be by then. They'd be the same thing they were now, just farther from home. She took one more look at the planet before she began the departure sequence. The planet that had no weapon signature. The planet that was all weapon signature. The planet that had looked at the possibility of its own extinction 80 years ago and responded by building more, and then gone back to watching animals in drainage canals, because the system was running, because the willingness was real, because they were always ready and never wanted to be, which was the most human thing of all. The engines came online. The survey vessel began its departure trajectory. Below them, in the blue-green quiet, a signal was still broadcasting toward the probe they dropped, patient, hopeful, reaching into the silence with the absolute certainty of a species that had always believed, against all evidence and without any contact, that they were not alone. They were right. They just weren't ready to know it. Neither, Vethkara's thought, was anyone else. The Conclave would add Earth to the monitored list. It would sit in a file in a division she'd never have clearance for, one more system in a galaxy full of systems, except that every analyst who looked at the file would do what she'd done, read the war list, check the cessation column, note the 11 minutes, count the hidden satellites, and feel the particular weight of a civilization that had looked at the end of everything and decided to keep going anyway. Not because it was rational. Because they couldn't stop. Because stubborn was an insult and a compliment and an instruction manual and a survival strategy, and somewhere in the 47 years of noise they'd been broadcasting into the dark, the truest thing they'd ever said about themselves. Somewhere below, in a city she'd never visited on a planet she'd spent months observing from orbit, a human was watching a screen, watching an animal be rescued from a drainage canal, feeling something large and genuine and uncomplicated in a life that also contained, just below the surface of normal days, the quiet and constant awareness that everything could end, that the systems were armed, that the willingness was real, and that the darkness outside the window was empty. Or had been. The survey vessel crossed the boundary of the system's outer orbital plane. The planet fell away behind them. The transmission, still broadcasting, chased them for a while, that patient, hopeful signal aimed at a probe that couldn't answer. And then it faded too, swallowed by distance and the weight of all the space between stars. The Conclave, 400 years old and wiser than it had ever been comfortable admitting, had decided to leave the humans alone. It was the most afraid the Conclave had ever been. And the humans never knew. They just kept broadcasting. Into the dark.